Walter's hands, gnarled as the oak branches above, clutched a folded piece of paper, an invitation, or so he'd thought. The paper was worn, its creases soft from years of handling, a relic from a life that felt like someone else's. His faded green jacket hung loose on his frame, the kind of jacket you'd see on a farmer or mechanic, not a man who'd once stormed the beaches of Normandy. A small anchor tattoo, barely visible beneath the cuff of his sleeve, hinted at a past he rarely spoke of. His eyes, pale blue and sharp, despite his 89 years, scanned the community center's entrance, where a young volunteer in a bright yellow vest stood clipboard in hand. "Sorry, sir," the volunteer said, barely glancing up. "This event's invite only. Your name's not on the list." Walter's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just nodded, the motion small, practiced, like a man who'd heard variations of this dismissal for decades. "Must have got it wrong," he murmured, his voice low, gravelly, like stones shifting in a riverbed. He tucked the paper into his pocket and turned away, his steps slow but steady on the uneven pavement. The volunteer didn't look up, already distracted by the next person in line, a councilman in a pressed suit, waving his invitation like a flag. No one noticed the way Walter's hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of memory. Every evening in the quiet of his small clapboard house, he'd sit at his kitchen table, a single bulb casting shadows over a worn photo album. The faces in those photos, young men with crooked grins, their helmets tilted at jaunty angles, were ghosts now. His brothers in arms, lost to the chaos of Omaha Beach, to the hedgerows of France, to time itself. He'd traced their names with a calloused finger. Tommy, who'd sung off key to keep their spirits up. Eddie, who'd shared his last cigarette before the landing craft hit the shore. Frank, who never made it past the first wave. Walter missed them, a quiet ache that hadn't dulled in 80 years. The world had moved on, but he hadn't. Not really. He walked past the diner, where the smell of bacon grease and fresh pies spilled onto the street. A few regulars glanced up from their coffee mugs, their eyes sliding over him like he was part of the scenery, a fixture like the cracked bell in the town square. Walter didn't mind. He'd learned long ago that invisibility came with age, with the way his shoulders stooped and his stories stayed locked behind a polite smile. He'd been a Marine, 1st Division, one of the first to hit the sand on June 6, 1944. But that was a lifetime ago, and Willow Creek wasn't a place that lingered on the past. The town was small, its heart rooted in high school football games and 4th of July parades, not in the quiet sacrifices of men like Walter. At home, he eased into his chair, the one with the sagging cushion that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, though he hadn't smoked in years. The photo album sat on the table, its leather cover cracked like parched earth. He opened it, the pages whispering under his fingers. There they were. Tommy, Eddie, Frank, frozen in black and white, their eyes bright with the reckless hope of youth. Walter's own face stared back from one photo, lean and serious, his helmet casting a shadow over his brow. He'd been 20 then, barely old enough to shave. Now his reflection in the window showed a man carved by time, his hair thin and white, his skin etched with lines deeper than the hedgerows he'd fought through. He didn't hear the screen door creak open, didn't see his granddaughter, Ellie, step inside. At 16, Ellie was all sharp edges and restless energy, her earbuds dangling from her neck, her phone glowing in her hand. She'd been staying with Walter for the summer, sent by her mother to keep an eye on Grandpa while she worked double shifts at the hospital in the next town over. Ellie loved Walter, but she didn't know him, not really. To her, he was just Grandpa, the quiet man who made her pancakes on Sundays and told bad jokes about fish. His stories about the war, the few he'd shared, had always felt like background noise, something old people rambled about. She'd nod, half listening, her mind on her friends or the latest TikTok trend. "Hey, Grandpa," she said, tossing her backpack onto the couch. "You eat yet?" Walter closed the album, his movements slow, deliberate. "Not hungry," he said, offering a small smile. "You go on, though. There's leftovers in the fridge." Ellie hesitated, her eyes flicking to the album. She'd seen it before, of course, but never paid it much mind. It was just another piece of her grandpa's clutter, like the old radio that didn't work, or the stack of National Geographic magazines in the corner. "You looking at those pictures again?" she asked, her tone light but edged with impatience. You're always doing that. Walter's smile didn't waver, but his eyes dimmed just for a moment. Keeps him close, he said softly. He didn't expect her to understand. How could she? She was young, her world full of noise and possibility. His was a world of echoes. Ellie shrugged and headed to the kitchen, her sneakers scuffing the linoleum. Walter watched her go, his heart heavy with a grief he couldn't name. It wasn't her fault. The gap between them wasn't just years. It was a chasm of experience, of loss, of a world that no longer cared to remember. He'd tried once or twice to tell her about D-Day, about the way the sea had churned red and the air had screamed with artillery. But her eyes would glaze over and he'd stop, swallowing the words. Some things were too heavy to share. The next morning, Willow Creek buzzed with preparations for the annual Veterans Day ceremony. The town square was strung with red, white, and blue bunting, and a small stage had been set up near the flagpole. Walter didn't plan to go. He hadn't in years, not since the last time he'd tried to attend, only to be turned away for lack of a proper invitation. The memory stung, though he'd never admit it. Instead, he'd spend the day at home, maybe walk to the cemetery where a few of his old buddies rested, their names carved into simple stones. Ellie, though, was caught up in the excitement. Her school's history club was helping organize the event, and she'd been roped into handing out programs. She didn't know why it bothered her, seeing her grandpa stay behind. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at that album last night, his fingers lingering on the faces like he was saying goodbye. Maybe it was the way he'd stood at the community center gates yesterday. She'd seen him from across the street, seen the way his shoulders sagged when he walked away. It wasn't right, she thought, though she couldn't quite say why. At the ceremony, the mayor droned on about sacrifice and freedom, his voice tinny through the microphone. The crowd clapped politely, but their attention wandered, to their phones, to the kids chasing each other around the square. Ellie stood at the edge of the stage, her arms crossed, her mind drifting to her grandpa. She'd never asked him about the war, not really. She knew he'd been a Marine, that he'd fought in World War II, but it was all so distant, like something out of a textbook. She didn't know the man in those photos, the one who'd survived when so many hadn't. Back at the house, Walter sat at his table, the album open again. His hands shook as he turned the pages, not from age, but from something deeper, something that clawed at him in the quiet. He didn't notice the faint fog creeping into his mind, the way names and dates sometimes slipped away like sand through his fingers. The doctors had called it dementia, early stages, they said. Walter didn't like the word. It sounded like defeat, and he'd never been one to surrender. But some days he'd reach for a memory, Tommy's laugh, the smell of gunpowder, and find nothing but a blank space. He didn't hear Ellie come home, didn't see her pause in the doorway, her eyes catching on the open album. She'd meant to grab her charger and head back to the ceremony, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the way the light fell on the photos, making the young men in them seem almost alive. Maybe it was the way her grandpa's shoulders hunched, like he was carrying a weight she couldn't see. She stepped closer, her sneakers silent on the worn rug. "Grandpa?" she said softly. He looked up, startled, his eyes clouded for a moment before they cleared. "Ellie, didn't hear you come in." She nodded at the album. "Who are they? The guys in the pictures?" Walter hesitated, his fingers tightening on the page. He hadn't talked about them in years, not since his wife Clara had passed. But Ellie was watching him, her eyes curious, not impatient this time. He took a breath, the air catching in his throat. "They were my squad," he said. "1st Marine Division. We hit Omaha Beach together. June 6th, 1944. Ellie frowned, trying to piece it together. "Omaha Beach? That's D-Day, right?" He nodded, his gaze drifting back to the photos. "Yeah, D-Day." She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, the album between them. "What was it like?" Walter's eyes met hers, searching for something, maybe disbelief, maybe boredom. But all he saw was her, his granddaughter, waiting. So he started to talk. He told her about the landing craft, the way the waves had rocked them like a cradle before spitting them into hell. He told her about Tommy, who'd joked about writing a letter to his girl back home right before a shell took him. About Eddie, who'd carried a wounded man on his back for a mile, only to fall to a sniper's bullet. About Frank, who'd been so sure they'd all make it home, Ellie listened, her phone forgotten on the table. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to carry the weight of his words, but she saw the way his eyes shone, the way his voice grew steady as he spoke, like he was back there, young and unbreakable. And she saw something else, too, a loneliness that clung to him, a sense that he'd been carrying this alone for too long. When he finished, the room was quiet, the only sound the tick of the clock on the wall. Ellie reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the album. "Why don't you ever go to the Veterans Day thing?" she asked. They'd they'd want to hear this, right? Walter shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. They don't need an old man's stories. Got their own heroes now. Ellie's jaw tightened. She thought of the mayor's speech, all pomp and no substance. She thought of the volunteer at the gate, turning her grandpa away. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. She didn't know how to fix it, but she knew she had to try. The next day, Ellie skipped school. She didn't tell Walter where she was going, just kissed his cheek and said she'd be back for dinner. She headed to the VFW hall, her backpack slung over one shoulder, the photo album tucked carefully inside. She'd spent the night reading through it, not just looking at the pictures, but reading the captions Walter had written in his careful, looping script. Names, dates, places. A folded letter, brittle with age, tucked into the back. A commendation from his CO, praising his courage under fire. A faded ribbon pinned to a page, its purple heart unmistakable. At the VFW, she found Mr. Thompson, the grizzled post commander who'd known Walter since they were boys. He was behind the bar, polishing glasses, his own marine cap perched on a shelf nearby. "Ellie," he said, squinting, "what brings you here?" She set the album on the counter, her hands steady, despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "It's about Grandpa. Walter Ellis. He was at Normandy and no one knows. They turned him away from the ceremony yesterday. They didn't even know his name." Mr. Thompson's face softened, his eyes flicking to the album. He knew Walter's story. Everyone who'd grown up in Willow Creek did, back when the war was still fresh. But time had a way of burying things, even heroes. He opened the album, his fingers tracing the same pages Walter had. "Your grandpa never was one for attention," he said. "But you're right. This ain't how it should be." Ellie leaned forward, her voice fierce. "Then let's fix it. He deserves better." They all do. The VFW hall smelled of polished wood and old coffee, its walls lined with faded photos of men in uniform, their faces frozen in time. Ellie stood at the counter, her hands gripping the edges of Walter's photo album, her heart pounding with a mix of determination and nerves. Mr. Thompson flipped through the pages, his weathered fingers pausing on a photo of Walter and his squad, their arms slung around each other, grinning like they'd just won a bet. The caption, in Walter's careful script, read, "Tommy, Eddie, Frank, and me. Cherbourg, July 44. We thought we'd live forever." Thompson closed the album, his eyes distant. "Your grandpa never talked much about Normandy," he said. "Not even to us old-timers. Always said it wasn't his story to tell. It was theirs." He nodded at the album, meaning the men who didn't come home. Ellie's throat tightened. "But it is his story. And no one knows it. They turned him away yesterday, Mr. Thompson. Like he didn't belong." Thompson leaned back, his chair creaking. He'd seen Walter's quiet decline over the years, the way he'd stopped coming to the VFW, stopped marching in parades. It wasn't just age or the dementia creeping in, it was the slow erasure of a man who'd given everything and asked for nothing. "What are you thinking, kid?" he asked. Ellie didn't hesitate. "I want to make it right, at the next ceremony, Memorial Day maybe. I want people to know who he is, what he did. Not just some speech, but something real. Something that makes them see him." Thompson studied her, his eyes narrowing with a spark of respect. "All right," he said, "let's do it. But we'll need more than this album. We need the town." Over the next few months, Ellie became a force of nature. She spent her afternoons at the VFW, poring over records with Thompson, tracking down old articles about the 1st Marine Division. She found a clipping from the Willow Creek Gazette, dated 1945, mentioning Walter's Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds sustained at Omaha Beach. She dug deeper, finding a letter from a fallen Marine's mother, thanking Walter for carrying her son to safety before he died. Each discovery was a piece of her grandfather she'd never known, a man who'd been a hero not just in battle, but in the quiet moments after. At home, Walter's world grew smaller. The dementia was subtle but relentless, stealing names and dates like a thief in the night. Some days he'd call Ellie by her mother's name or stare at the album like he was seeing it for the first time. But when he spoke of the war, his voice was clear, his memories sharp as shrapnel. Ellie started recording him, her phone propped on the table, capturing stories she wished she'd asked for sooner. She learned about the landing craft's icy spray, the weight of a rifle in trembling hands, the way Tommy's laugh had cut through the fear before the shells started falling. She learned about the guilt Walter carried, not for surviving, but for living so long without them. Ellie didn't tell him about her plan. She wasn't sure he'd approve. Walter wasn't one for fanfare. He'd always shied away from attention, deflecting praise with a shrug or a bad joke. But she saw the way his eyes dimmed when he thought no one was watching, the way he lingered over the album, like it was all he had left. She couldn't let him fade away, not like this. By spring, Willow Creek was buzzing with whispers of something big. Ellie had recruited her history club, a handful of classmates who'd been skeptical at first, but got swept up in her passion. They helped her organize a Memorial Day tribute, not just for Walter, but for all the forgotten veterans of the town. Thompson pulled strings with the town council, securing the community center for the event. No guest lists, no gates, just an open door. The local paper ran a story, calling it A Day to Remember, and Ellie made sure every detail was perfect. A display of Walter's photos, a timeline of his service, even a replica of his Marine uniform, borrowed from a museum in the next county. The morning of Memorial Day, the air was soft and warm, carrying the scent of blooming lilacs and fresh-cut grass. The town square was alive with people, families, veterans, kids waving small flags. The flagpole gleamed under the sun, its stars and stripes snapping in the breeze. Ellie stood at the edge of the crowd, her stomach in knots, watching for Walter. She'd convinced him to come, telling him it was just a small gathering, nothing special. He'd grumbled but agreed, his old Marine cap perched on his head, his jacket buttoned despite the warmth. As Walter approached, leaning on his cane, the crowd parted slightly, their eyes catching on the anchor tattoo peeking from his sleeve. He didn't notice the way people whispered, didn't see the way Thompson nodded to Ellie from the stage. The ceremony began with the national anthem, the notes soaring over the square, and Walter stood straighter, his hand over his heart. Ellie watched him, her chest tight with something she couldn't name, pride maybe, or love, or the weight of all he'd carried alone. When Thompson took the microphone, his voice was steady but warm, like a man telling a story by a fire. "We're here to honor our veterans," he said, "but today we're shining a light on one in particular, a man who's been in this town his whole life, who fought for us before most of us were born. Walter Ellis." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Walter's head snapped up, his eyes wide with confusion. Ellie slipped her hand into his, squeezing gently. "Just listen, Grandpa," she whispered. Thompson went on, his voice carrying the weight of truth. He spoke of Walter's service, of the beaches of Normandy, of the men who didn't come home. He held up the album, its pages projected on a screen behind him, each photo a window into a past the town had forgotten. There was Walter, young and fierce, his rifle slung over his shoulder. There was Tommy, grinning with a cigarette dangling from his lips. There was Eddie, his face smudged with dirt, but his eyes bright. The crowd was silent, their phones forgotten, their eyes fixed on the images. Then Thompson called Ellie to the stage. She hesitated, her heart pounding, but Walter's small nod pushed her forward. She took the microphone, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger. "My grandpa never told me he was a hero," she said. "He didn't have to. These pictures, these stories, they tell it for him. He carried his friends through hell, and he's been carrying them ever since. But he shouldn't have to do it alone." "Hey!" She turned to Walter, who stood at the edge of the stage, his eyes glistening. "Grandpa, this is for you, for Tommy, Eddie, Frank, and all the others. We see you now." The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of sound that rolled over Walter like a tide. He blinked, his hand tightening on his cane, and for a moment, Ellie thought he might turn away, overwhelmed. But then a young Marine in dress blues stepped forward, one of the local reservists. He snapped a salute, crisp and deliberate, his eyes locked on Walter's. One by one, other veterans in the crowd followed. Old men in VFW caps, younger ones in fatigues, their hands rising in unison. Walter's lips parted, his breath catching, but he returned the salute, his hand steady for the first time that day. Ellie stepped down, handing the microphone to Thompson, who announced the unveiling of a new plaque in the town square. It was simple, bronze, set into a stone near the flagpole, in honor of Walter Ellis and the 1st Marine Division for their courage at Normandy and beyond. Willow Creek remembers. Ellie had worked with the History Club to design it, pooling their allowances to cover the cost. The crowd pressed forward, their voices a low hum of awe and respect, as Walter approached the plaque. He didn't speak, just traced the letters with his fingers, his face unreadable, but his eyes alive with something new. Relief, maybe, or peace. The ceremony ended with a bugler playing taps, the notes lingering in the air like a prayer. Walter stood by the plaque, his cap clutched in his hands, as people came forward to shake his hand, to thank him, to say his name. Ellie watched from a distance, her heart full but aching. She knew the dementia would keep stealing pieces of him, that he might not remember this day in a year or even a month. But for now he was seen. He was known. That evening, back at the house, Walter sat at his table, the album open once more. Ellie sat beside him, her phone off, her earbuds tucked away. The silence between them was comfortable, warm, like the glow of the single bulb overhead. Walter turned a page, his fingers lingering on a photo of his squad. They'd have liked this, he said, his voice soft but clear. Tommy would have made a joke about the plaque being too fancy. Ellie smiled, her eyes stinging. You think so? He nodded, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. I know so. Outside, Willow Creek was settling into dusk, the air thick with the scent of lilacs and the distant sound of laughter from the square. The plaque gleamed under the streetlights, a small but permanent mark of a man who'd been invisible too long. The town was different now, Ellie thought. Not just because of the plaque, but because of the way people looked at each other, the way they lingered a little longer when they passed an old man on the street. It was a start. Walter closed the album, his hands steady for the first time in months. You did good, kid, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. We did good, Grandpa. This is the end of Walter and Ellie's story, but the call to notice the quiet heroes in our lives continues. Who in your community carries a story untold? Take a moment to see them, to listen. Subscribe to Hoffman Stories for more tales of compassion and courage, and let's keep the legacy of honor alive.